For 5 years, I showed up first, stayed last, and handed my boss every idea I had. Then she stole my biggest project, promoted a guy who did nothing, and I walked into that party and ended her career in front of everyone. The conference room was already full when I arrived. I knew it the moment I stepped off the elevator and saw the frosted glass lit up from inside, shadows moving behind it. I had been in that room until 11:30 the night before. I had left my bag under my desk. I had set my alarm for 5:45 so I could go home, shower, change, and be back before 7. I had a granola bar for dinner. I had sent Sandra a final check-in text at 11:15 p.m. to confirm everything was ready. She had responded with a thumbs-up emoji. That room was supposed to be mine to open. I stood in the hallway for a moment and looked at the door, the handle, the thin strip of light leaking underneath it. There was a sound on the other side, the low, warm murmur of a conversation already in progress, the kind of laughter that means everyone in a room is comfortable. I checked my phone, 6:58 a.m. The presentation wasn't scheduled until 9. Then I pushed the door open. Sandra Alcott was standing at the head of the table in the cream blazer she saved for client meetings. My slides were projected on the wall behind her. My exact words, the ones I had written at 11 o'clock the night before while sitting cross-legged on my office floor because my back hurt too much to keep sitting in my chair, were coming out of her mouth in that smooth, authoritative cadence she had spent years perfecting. The Heartwell clients were arranged around the conference table, 7 of them. 2 had flown in from Chicago. I knew that because I had booked their hotels. The coffee service in front of them, I had coordinated that too, called the catering team on Friday afternoon to confirm the time, specified that the CFO of Heartwell had a severe dairy allergy. Everything in that room had been arranged by me. Everything on those walls had been created by me, except the woman presenting it. She spotted me in the doorway. For one beat, one fraction of a second, something moved across her face. I had learned to read that face over 5 years, and I knew what that flicker was. Not guilt, not exactly. It was the micro-calculation of someone who had anticipated this moment and had already prepared for it. Oh good. Her voice was warm and controlled. The voice she kept in a separate drawer for clients and performance reviews. The voice that made people in boardrooms feel taken care of. Jenna, can you grab coffee for everyone? We just ran out. One of the Heartwell clients turned around in his chair. Middle-aged man, silver cufflinks, the kind of smile that was really an appraisal. He looked between me and Sandra with the mild curiosity of a person who had noticed something but couldn't quite name it. Aren't you presenting this? He asked me. I think I saw your name on the preliminary outreach email. There was a pause. It lasted about 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, a lot of things happened inside my chest. But Sandra filled the pause before any of them could become visible. Oh no, she said, turning back to the room with a small, self-deprecating wave of her hand. This is my project. Jenna just helped with some research along the way. She's very thorough. She turned back to me. The smile stayed on. Every tooth present. The coffee, Jenna. Thank you. I got the coffee. I stood in the kitchen alcove with the pot in my hand and the door swinging shut behind me, and I looked at the pot and I thought about all of it at once. The 112 slides. The competitive landscape analysis I had compiled across 6 different industry databases over a 72-hour stretch in week 2. The night I had restructured the entire pricing model at Sandra's request because she had a feeling the client would respond better to a different framework, her text had come in at 9:47 p.m. on a Wednesday, and I had done it sitting on my kitchen floor with my laptop because my dad was asleep in the next room and I didn't want to wake him with the light from the living room. The 14 drafts of the executive narrative. The appendix I had built from scratch at 2 in the morning because Sandra had mentioned in passing that thorough supporting documentation gives clients confidence, and I had taken that as an instruction because by that point I took everything as an instruction because it felt like the only way to stay ahead of her disappointment. I thought about the Friday 3 weeks before the pitch when my dad's oncologist had called at 8 p.m. to tell me there was a potential complication in his blood work and they needed to run additional imaging the next morning. I had a standing appointment to accompany him to that imaging. I had been planning it for 2 weeks. I canceled it. I stayed at my desk and finished the final revision pass instead, and a neighbor drove my dad to the hospital, and by the time I got there in the afternoon, the imaging was done, and he was in a chair in the waiting area with a cup of bad coffee, and he looked at me when I walked in and said, "You didn't have to come," and I said, "I know," and I sat down next to him and did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say. I brought the coffee into the conference room on a tray. I stood against the wall for the next 2 hours and watched my work be delivered by someone else. Watched the clients lean forward during the market expansion section, the section I had titled The Overlooked Opportunity, a phrase Sandra had initially called a bit dramatic and then used 7 times in her verbal delivery without changing a syllable. Watched the man with the silver cufflinks flip to the appendix and announce with genuine admiration in his voice that it was the most thorough supporting document he had seen in 15 years of evaluating vendor pitches. Sandra accepted the compliment without blinking. The contract was worth $4.2 million over 3 years, the largest single client engagement in Whitmore Group's 22-year history. I knew that because I had written that sentence in the executive summary. This engagement represents the largest strategic partnership in Whitmore Group's 22-year history. But let me go back, because Sandra Alcott didn't start with Heartwell, and she didn't start with me understanding what she was. She started the same way all of them do, gradually enough that you rationalize every step. I joined Whitmore Group in January of 2019. I was 26 years old, 8 months out of a master's program in communication promotion strategy at Georgetown, carrying $62,000 in student loan debt and a very sincere, deeply held belief that hard work was a currency that paid out eventually if you were patient enough with the exchange rate. I was hired as a senior associate on the content strategy team. Salary was $68,000 a year, which felt like real money at the time, which tells you something about 26. Sandra Alcott was my direct manager. She had been with the company for 11 years. She was 44. She was smart in the specific way that certain people are smart, not with ideas exactly, but with the management of other people's ideas. She knew how to evaluate good thinking when she saw it. She knew how to position it. She was very good at being in the room when something landed well. In the first 6 months, I thought she was generous. She praised me openly in team meetings. She sent my early work upstairs with notes like, "Jenna really knocked this one out of the park." She told me I had a rare instinct for strategic framing. I worked harder. I stayed later. I brought her better and better material, and she kept walking it upstairs, and people kept telling her she had exceptional strategic clarity and an impressive ability to develop talent on her team. I thought that was how it worked, that managers synthesized and elevated their team's contributions, and that the recognition would reach me eventually by the indirect route of Sandra's success, lifting all of us. I thought I was building something, a career, a reputation, a record of delivering that would eventually speak for itself. The first time I saw the pattern clearly, I mean really saw it, not just the edge of it, was in March of 2020. I had spent 3 weeks developing a full content restructuring proposal for one of our anchor clients, a regional healthcare network called Delmarva Partners. It was detailed, original work. I had done audience segmentation analysis, channel-by-channel performance reviews, a 12-month implementation roadmap with quarterly benchmarks. I emailed the completed document to Sandra on a Sunday night, 87 pages, fully formatted. With an executive summary she could present verbatim. She replied 15 minutes later, "Perfect, I'll take it from here." That Tuesday, she presented it to the Whitmore executive team and the client in a joint review session. She had reformatted the slides and put her name in the header. She had not changed a single recommendation, not one. The executive team praised her thinking. The client signed an expanded scope agreement on the strength of the proposal's rigor. I mentioned it to her afterward, carefully, in the way you do when you are still afraid of being called difficult, still operating under the assumption that the working relationship is fragile and you are the junior party, and the fragility is your problem to manage. "You'll get credit," she told me. "I'll make sure you're seen." She said it with such certainty, such warmth that I believed her. I was 27 years old and I had not yet learned that "I'll make sure you're seen" is something people say instead of actually making sure you're seen. It is a way of closing a conversation. It is a promise made in the present tense that has no mechanism for being kept, because the person making it has no intention of keeping it. They simply prefer the conversation to end. She mentioned me in a team meeting 2 weeks later as part of the group that contributed to the Delmarva restructuring work. The group. There was no group. There was me, my apartment in Capitol Hill, 3 weeks of evenings, and the 18-page bibliography I had compiled in a footnote section that Sandra removed from the client copy because she found footnotes cluttered. I told myself this was normal, that I was still early in my tenure, that the recognition would compound the way interest compounds, that each year of demonstrated value was being deposited somewhere and would eventually amount to something I could spend. That is a story I told myself very convincingly for a very long time, and I have spent a lot of time since then trying to understand what it cost me to keep telling it. Between 2020 and 2022, I became, without ever being given the title, the operational engine of Sandra's entire client portfolio. I managed client relationships she had grown too busy, or too bored, to maintain personally. I drafted the quarterly strategy documents she presented in senior reviews. I developed the methodologies her team used and trained junior employees on their implementation. I managed client escalations. I covered her absences without being asked. I was the person other people on our floor came to when they needed something done correctly and done fast. And when they thanked Sandra for it, she accepted the thanks and said something like, "That's the culture we've built here." 2 junior employees I trained both received promotions ahead of me. The first was a young woman named Priya, who had been at the company for 18 months when she was elevated to senior associate, a title I already held, so this is less about parity and more about what it telegraphed. The second was a young man named Callum, who had been at the company for 14 months when he was given a senior associate title and a salary of $94,000, a 22% increase. I know his salary because he told me over lunch. We were friendly in the way that colleagues who respect each other are friendly. When I asked Sandra about my own advancement trajectory during my annual review that same April, she told me I was performing at a high level and that the timing wasn't right for a promotion conversation. She said it with a kind of rehearsed sympathy that I recognized later as the same expression she used when she was declining meeting requests from clients she found tedious. Callum had used my onboarding materials. I had built those in my second week on the job because no onboarding materials existed, and I had wanted the next person to have a better orientation than I did. I thought that was just what you did. You improved the systems you moved through. I want to be honest about what I could have done differently in those 3 years. I could have pushed harder in performance reviews. I could have escalated to HR. I could have had direct conversations with Sandra's managers. I did none of those things. I kept working and kept delivering and kept believing, with a stubbornness that I now understand was partly pride and partly fear, that the work itself was the argument. The work was never the argument. Sandra was was the argument, and she was very good at it. In August of 2022, my father was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. I have written and deleted the sentence that follows that one several times, the one that tries to describe what it was like. I cannot write that sentence in a way that does it justice, so I will simply say that it was the thing that changed the calculation. Not Sandra, not the stolen credit, not the promotions I did not receive. My father's diagnosis was the thing that made everything visible as what it was, a system I was inside of that was not designed to give me anything, and that would keep taking from me for as long as I allowed it to. His name is Michael Albright. He was 61 years old when he was diagnosed. He worked as a machinist for 31 years at a manufacturing plant in Gaithersburg. He was retired by then. The plant had downsized in 2018, and he had taken the severance and spent the next 4 years doing exactly what he wanted, which was fishing, watching the gnats, and growing tomatoes in the backyard of his house in Silver Spring. He was the kind of person who never complained about anything because he believed complaining was a form of disrespect toward people who had it worse. He had it worse than most for a while in his life. He never complained. He started chemotherapy in September of 2022, twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, at Washington Adventist Hospital in Tacoma Park. The infusions were 3 hours each. My mother had moved to Tucson after their divorce in 2017. Quiet, mutual, the kind of ending that long marriages sometimes arrive at without drama. My dad's closest sibling, his brother Walter, lived in Cleveland. It was just me. I went to Sandra in the first week of September. I had a prepared request, calm and specific. 2 remote work days per week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, for the duration of his active treatment, which his oncologist estimated at 6 to 7 months. I had already confirmed with our IT team that everything I did could be done remotely. I had documented the arrangement in a draft email, so Sandra would have a written record. I had thought it through carefully because I had learned in 3.5 years that Sandra responded better to things that had been thought through carefully. She sighed. Not a sigh of empathy, a sigh of inconvenience. The kind of sigh that people make when something has been placed in their lap that they would prefer not to have to deal with. I suppose we can manage for a month or two, she said. Not, of course. Not, take whatever time you need. Not, I'm sorry, that sounds really hard. A month or two. As though she were the one absorbing the cost. As though my father's illness were a logistical problem that she was graciously agreeing to work around. I said thank you. I meant it. I was that grateful for a month or two. The arrangement worked exactly as I had told her it would. I was remote on Tuesdays and Thursdays, in the office Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and reachable by phone and email at all times, including during the drives to the hospital. My output did not decrease. If anything, it increased, because I was working from wherever I happened to be. The hospital waiting room, the car, my dad's kitchen table while he slept. Instead of commuting an hour round trip, I was the first to respond to after-hours messages. I was still meeting every deadline. 3 months in, she called me into her office and told me the remote arrangement had run its course. I remember the exact phrase because I had never heard it applied to a situation like this. Run its course. Like the accommodation was a temporary measure that had naturally resolved. Like stage 3 colon cancer had a natural endpoint at the 3-month mark. It's no longer sustainable for the team, she said. She looked genuinely uncomfortable, which I think she mistook for conscience. We need consistency. Dad was halfway through treatment. The most critical period, in terms of immune suppression, infection risk, fatigue management, was still ahead of us. I explained this. I explained that his oncologist had specifically flagged the next 4 months as the phase requiring the most consistent support. I asked what she needed from me to make it work. That's not really something I can solve for you, she said. There was a window behind her. I remember looking at it. 42nd floor, view of the waterfront, a clear November afternoon. I hired a car service. 2 days a week, $60 per round trip, $120 a week, $480 a month. The car service was reliable. The drivers were kind. They did not know my father, but they knew his name and his address, and that he needed someone to walk him from the door. I drained my emergency fund over the next 4 months, which at its peak had contained $11,000, and which by February of 2023 contained $1,400. I was still first in the office every morning. I was still answering messages at night. I was still delivering everything Sandra put in front of me. I was just also exhausted in a way that had begun to feel structural, not tiredness from a particular week, but the baseline of a person operating under sustained pressure with no visible end. There is something else I need to say about this period. In October of 2022, before the remote arrangement was revoked, I had made the mistake of telling Sandra something true and personal. I was having a hard week. My dad had had a rough infusion, the car had needed an unexpected repair, and I had not slept well in 10 days. I mentioned it. Not in a performance review, not in a formal setting, just in passing, in her office, at the end of a check-in conversation. I said I was tired. She responded warmly. She said she understood. She said family illness was incredibly hard and that she admired how I was managing it. 2 months later, when I raised a concern in a team meeting about a project timeline she had set without consulting me, she turned to the room and said, almost as an aside, that I had been managing some personal difficulties and that the team should give me some grace. She said it in the tone of a person being generous and understanding. She said it in front of 3 colleagues and our skip-level manager. I had not asked for grace. I had asked for a realistic timeline. That was her technique with information. She collected your vulnerabilities with the warmth of someone who cared about you. She filed them away somewhere clean and organized. She only retrieved retrieved them when she needed to explain you away, when your competence or your clarity or your pushback became inconvenient, and she needed a frame that made it look like something else. She's going through some things. She's been under a lot of strain. A preemptive context that made any objection I raised sound like it was coming from a compromised place. I did not understand the full shape of it until much later. At the time, I simply felt, in those moments, a particular kind of invisible. Then Heartwell came. October 2023. The Heartwell Group was a mid-Atlantic commercial real estate developer with a $14 billion portfolio and a communications problem. They had grown faster than their brand presence. They had the assets, the market position, and the regional influence of a major firm, but their public-facing identity was still calibrated to the mid-sized developer they had been 7 years ago. The RFP was 37 pages long. Our CEO, Richard Voss, had flagged it personally in an all-hands as a priority engagement, the kind of opportunity that defines what Whitmore Group is capable of. Sandra dropped the RFP printout on my desk on a Monday morning. She did not sit down. She did not brief me on the background or the client's priorities or the competitive context. She set it down, said, "Make it sing. I need a preliminary deck by Friday," and left for a lunch meeting. I did not say anything. I picked up the RFP and started reading. I built the entire pitch over the next 4 weeks, from zero, in the hours available between existing deliverables and the hours after 10 p.m., when I could think without interruption. I did the competitive landscape research, mapped 5 comparable communications firms' approaches to similar clients, identified the gaps in their positioning, constructed the argument for why Whitmore's approach was distinct. I mapped Heartwell's portfolio against the communication gaps in their market segment, identified 3 specific high-value properties where brand ambiguity was actively suppressing investor interest, and built an analysis showing how a coherent communication strategy could close that gap within 18 months. I developed the strategic framework from scratch. The channel recommendations, which platforms, which audiences, which content cadences, with specific benchmarks tied to Heartwell's stated growth targets. The case studies, drawn from comparable engagements in our own history and from the broader industry, formatted so the Heartwell team could see themselves in the narrative. The pricing model, which I built in 3 versions, conservative, recommended, and accelerated, with assumptions documented for each. The appendix, which took 4 nights by itself, supporting data, methodology notes, competitive intelligence, everything the clients would need to evaluate the recommendation independently. I wrote the narrative that ran through the deck, the one about how Heartwell had grown faster than their story, and how Whitmore was the firm that could help them tell it. I wrote it 7 times before I thought it was right. I know it was 7 times because I have the version history. Sandra's involvement in the pitch consisted of the following: 1 review session in week 2, during which she left 8 comments on the draft slides. 6 were cosmetic, font adjustments, color suggestions, a request to move a chart from slide 44 to slide 41. 1 asked me to add a client testimonial she would source herself. She never sourced it. The 8th comment, on slide 14, said, "Love the framing here. Very me." On a Thursday night in week 4, at 8 p.m., my dad's oncologist called. There was a flag in his most recent blood work. Not definitive, she said, but worth imaging immediately. His standing appointment was the next morning at 9. I had planned to take him. I had it in my calendar. I canceled the calendar entry. I stayed at my desk and worked through the night. The Heartwell presentation was 10 days away, and I had 2 sections still in draft. A neighbor drove my dad to the imaging appointment. By the time I got there in the afternoon, the imaging was done, and the results were, thankfully, with enormous relief, clean. Dad was sitting in the waiting area with a crossword puzzle he had mostly finished. He looked up when I walked in and said, "You really didn't have to come." I sat down next to him. I didn't say anything. He went back to the crossword. The Monday before the Tuesday presentation, Sandra asked to review my final materials. Everything. Slides, research documents, the presenter notes, the recorded walkthrough I had made for my own reference, the source files for every chart and data visualization. She wanted it all by 3 p.m. I sent everything. Her reply came 40 minutes later. 1 line. "Looks great. I'll handle it from here." I remember reading that email. I remember the specific quality of the stillness I felt. Not surprise. I was past surprise. It was something older and quieter, a recognition of a pattern that I had been watching long enough that it had become familiar, and the familiarity of it was almost worse than if it had been new. I had done this before. I had handed her my work and watched her walk away with it before. I had told myself each time that the credit would come eventually, that the accumulation of delivered work would compound, that there was a ledger somewhere that kept honest records. There was no ledger. There was just Sandra and the conference room, and a room full of clients who had never heard my name. I got to the office at 7 the next morning anyway. Out of what, I am not entirely sure. Habit. Some residual belief that if I showed up it would matter. The door to the conference room was already lit up from inside. You know the rest of that morning. In the days after the Heartwell presentation, I became a different kind of employee. Not a worse one. Not a disengaged one. I still delivered everything I was supposed to deliver. I still answered my emails and met my deadlines and showed up on time. But something underneath the motion had changed. I was watching differently. I was paying attention with a specificity I had not applied before. I started keeping records. Not in some elaborate, premeditated way. I simply started forwarding myself emails. Anything that established authorship in a documentable form. My initial drafts, Sandra's revision comments, messages where she acknowledged the work was mine before she presented it as hers. I saved screenshots of Slack messages timestamped before 7 a.m. that showed me working on deliverables she would later present as her own strategic vision. I found, in a folder on my personal laptop, the voice memos I had taken during late-night calls with Sandra over the previous 2 years. I always recorded those calls. I had explained this to her in my first month on the job, told her I recorded instructions so I wouldn't have to ask her to repeat herself, and she had said, fine, whatever works for you. She had not thought about it since. I went through the recordings. There were 47 of them. Most were operational, task assignments, client background briefings, logistics, but there was one from September of 2022, the call where she had asked me to restructure the Heartwell pricing model at 11 p.m. In that recording, 6 minutes and 40 seconds in, Sandra said, just do the work and let me handle the client. I need this win for my promotion. I had noted it at the time as an instruction about client relationship management. She handled the client-facing relationship. I handled the analytical work. I thought she was telling me about our division of labor. I had not understood it as a statement of intent. Sitting with it in November of 2023, more than a year later, I understood it completely. I backed up every file to my personal drive, every draft, every research document, every version history with timestamps. I organized them by date. I labeled them with the project names and the presentation dates. I saved Sandra's email asking me to remove my name from the presenter notes. Just take your name off the notes page for the client copy. It looks cleaner. Alongside the version of the Heartwell deck with my authorship metadata still embedded in the file properties, the invisible record that Word documents keep of who created and last modified each file. I did not yet know exactly what I was building toward. I only knew that I was done being the person who showed up to a situation without the documentation to prove what had actually happened. They threw a party to celebrate the Heartwell contract. That is, specifically, what the invitation said. Heartwell contract celebration, executive floor, Friday, 6 p.m., semi-formal. I wore my navy blazer. I arrived at 6:15, not early enough to look eager, not late enough to look resentful. The executive floor conference room, the good room, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows and the view of the waterfront at sunset and the catering from the Italian restaurant on the ground floor, was full of people I had worked alongside for 5 years. Some of them I liked. Some of them knew me well enough to know what my contribution to this contract had actually been, and their presence in that room, holding their glasses of champagne and talking about Sandra's vision, was a specific kind of loneliness that I will not try to adequately describe. Richard Voss spoke first. He was a compact, deliberate man, mid-50s, careful in his movements, the kind of CEO who said less than he knew. He talked about the Heartwell contract for approximately 4 minutes. He used the words vision, leadership, strategic clarity, and competitive differentiation. He said it represented everything Whitmore Group stood for. He called Sandra to the front of the room and presented her with a crystal award that said, Excellence in Client Strategy, Q4 2023, on a brushed metal plate. People applauded. Sandra held the award at her side and delivered a gracious, measured acceptance. Credited the team, mentioned how proud she was of what they had built together, said Heartwell was just the beginning of what was possible. It was a good speech. She was good at speeches. She had given variations of this one before, always after work I had done, and she had gotten better at it over time. I thought about all the times I had contributed the raw material of her self-presentation without meaning to. I stood in the back of the room and held my champagne glass, and thought about the Friday night I had not gone to the hospital with my father. Then Richard said there was additional news. The Heartwell engagement had accelerated an organizational decision that had been under discussion for some time. Whitmore Group was creating a dedicated real estate communications practice, its own division, separate P&L, dedicated team. Sandra Alcott would be heading it, effective January 1st. A round of applause. Sandra looked appropriately humbled and appropriately excited simultaneously, which is a difficult combination to pull off, and she managed it effortlessly. Richard said the new division's first senior hire had already been made. He paused for half a beat. The way you pause when you're delivering news you know will land well. Patrick Dunn, he said. Patrick Dunn had been at the company for 6 months. He had come from a boutique PR firm in Virginia. He was 29 and personable and wore his suits well and had a talent I recognized because it mirrored a version of what Sandra had. He was very good at being in rooms where things were decided and at being warm in a way that read as substantive. I had spoken to him a dozen times in his 6 months at the firm. He had contributed nothing to the Heartwell pitch. I know this the way I know things I was actually present for. I had been the only person working on the Heartwell pitch. I watched Sandra nod at Patrick across the room, warm, collegial, welcoming him into the construct she was building, a team where she was the vision and the invisible people were somewhere in the back, in the kitchen alcove, getting coffee. Then she looked at me. She found me in the room without effort, the way you find people you have been tracking for years. Her expression did not change. Her voice carried easily. Jenna, just my name across a room full of people at a party thrown for her success. Not pulled aside, not whispered, said in public clearly as a demonstration. I'll need those quarterly reports by end of day Monday. I know you won't let me down. She smiled. The same smile she had been deploying on me for 5 years. The one that said, you are useful and you are contained, and I expect nothing has changed. I looked at her for a moment. I set my champagne glass down on the nearest table. I am not an impulsive person. I want to say that clearly before I describe what happened next, because I do not want this to read as a woman who snapped and did something she could not take back. That is not what happened. What happened was that 5 years of accumulation arrived at a temperature I could not hold anymore. And I had the documents in my possession, and I had finally understood. Standing in that room, listening to my name used as a delivery device for a task assignment at a party I had not been acknowledged at, that waiting for the institution to correct itself was not a strategy. It was a way of spending time that you did not get back. I walked across the room. I tapped Sandra on the shoulder. She was mid-conversation with Diane Price, our CFO. Diane was a careful, intelligent woman who had always treated me with a kind of distracted professional respect. She remembered my name and sometimes stopped me in the hallway to ask about projects I was working on, which was more than most senior leadership did. She looked up when I approached. A small group had assembled around Sandra, as always. Richard Voss was nearby, 3 other members of the executive team, a client liaison from Heartwell named Greg, who had been at the presentation. "I need to speak with you," I said. Now, Sandra turned. The smile came on. "Jenna, I'm in the middle of something." I know. Something in my voice made Diane Price go still. She was watching me with an expression I could not fully read, but her attention was specific and full. "This won't take long," I said. Sandra looked at me. The recalculation again. That micro-movement behind her eyes. Fast and controlled. Then, "Fine." "What?" I did not lower my voice. I did not move away from the group. I had decided, in the walk across the room, that this was not going to be a private conversation that could be reframed later. I was done with private conversations that got reframed. "Why is Patrick on the new divisions team?" I said, when I built every single piece of the Heartwell pitch. The temperature shifted. I felt it. The way conversations in a group recalibrate when something real enters them. People did not look away. That was the thing. Usually, in uncomfortable workplace moments, people find reasons to look at the middle distance or check their phones. Nobody did that. Sandra had the room's attention, and so did I. "The pitch was a team effort," she said. Smooth and immediate. She had an answer ready, which told me she had prepared for exactly this question. "I'm responsible for how resources are allocated on my team. You had me remove my name from the presenter notes." A beat. Her jaw moved very slightly. "That's standard practice for client-facing materials. Attribution goes to the firm. That's not company policy." I checked. "Watch your tone, Jenna. I stayed until midnight on that presentation, the night before the pitch, while you were at your son's basketball game, which I know because you texted me from the parking lot at 8:45 p.m. to ask me to add a slide about stakeholder communications." People were not pretending not to listen anymore. Richard Voss had taken 2 steps in our direction. Sandra stepped toward me, not aggressively, just a half-inch closer, the kind of movement that was meant to feel like authority, like the physical management of a situation. "I think you should take the rest of the day," she said, her voice low. "You're not. Deserving has nothing to do with it," she said, and I think she was being honest. I think she had a worldview in which the hierarchy was legitimate, and I was simply failing to accept my place in it. "You're a behind-the-scenes person. That's where you excel. Not everyone is built for the front of the room." I looked at her. I had worked for this woman for 5 years. I had given her my best thinking and my most careful work and my evenings and my weekends and the night my father needed me, and I had gone to the office instead. I had made her look brilliant in boardrooms and in executive reviews and in front of clients who flew in from Chicago. I had built the systems her team ran on, trained the people who got promoted ahead of me, and answered her texts at 11 p.m. on weeknights without complaint. And she was standing in a room full of witnesses, holding an award made of my work, telling me that this was simply my nature, that I was the kind of person who belonged out of sight. "Behind the scenes," I said. "You mean doing all the work while you take the credit?" She stepped closer again. "This conversation is over. I know about the recording, Sandra." Her face changed. It was subtle. "I want to be accurate about this because I am not interested in dramatizing it." She did not go pale. She did not stumble. What happened was smaller and more specific than that. The pilot light in her eyes went out and came back on within the span of a blink, and the rhythm of her breathing changed in a way that was visible in her shoulders. "I'm sorry? September 2022. You called me at 11 p.m. to restructure the pricing model. I record my calls when I'm taking detailed instructions. I told you that in my first month, and you said fine." I paused. "In that recording you said, and I can give you the exact words, 'Just do the work and let me handle the client. I need this win for my promotion.'" She said nothing. "I also have the email where you asked me to remove my name from the presenter notes on the Heartwell deck, and I have the original source files with the authorship metadata, which shows my name as the creator on every document you presented to that room." Richard Voss was standing directly adjacent to us now. He was not pretending to be elsewhere. My phone buzzed. I looked down. A message from Terrence, the neighbor 2 houses down from my dad's house in Silver Spring, the one who had found my dad on the front lawn at 9:30 p.m. 3 weeks ago, lying on the ground, unable to get up, after he'd slipped coming off the front porch, the night I had been standing in the Heartwell conference room holding a coffee tray while my boss took a bow. Terrence's message said, "Your dad fell again. They took him by ambulance to Holy Cross. He's asking for you." I looked at my phone. I looked at Sandra. The stillness I had felt building in me for weeks arrived all at once, clean and final. The kind of still that is not emptiness, but its opposite. Complete clarity about exactly one thing. "I'm not taking the day off," I said. "I'm quitting." All of the blood left Sandra's face in a way that I had never seen happen to a person before. 5 years, I said. My voice was even. I was not shaking. I had expected to shake. 5 years of being your workhorse. 5 years of watching you take take my work into rooms I was not invited to, and come out with awards for my thinking. 5 years of missing time with my sick father because I believed, genuinely, stupidly believed, that a company that takes everything you give and acts like you are invisible is a company that will eventually see you. Jennifer. Richard Voss. His voice was careful and low, and the voice of a man who understood that the situation had moved past the point where it could be managed with social pressure. No. I opened my phone. I had the email ready. I had prepared this. Not for this night, not consciously, but I had been carrying it for the past 3 weeks. In the same way that people who have been waiting for a moment they don't have a name for sometimes have the material ready without knowing why. I forwarded the email chain, Sandra's request to remove my name from the presenter section, alongside the file property screenshot showing my authorship on every Heartwell document, to Richard Voss's work email from my phone, standing in front of him. I just sent you the original Heartwell files, I said, including Sandra's email asking me to remove my name from the presenter section. The file metadata shows authorship timestamps on every document. Everything in that pitch has my name on it in the version history. I put my phone back in my pocket, and I have the recording. Richard looked at his phone. He opened the email I had just sent. His face did not change dramatically. He was a careful man, but something around his eyes shifted. What recording? He said. The one from September 2022, where Sandra told me directly, just do the work and let me handle the client. I need this win for my promotion. Sandra's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I had been on the receiving end of Sandra Alcott's voice for 5 years. I had heard it confident and warm and dismissive and managing and precise. I had heard it at 11 p.m. on work night calls and in the hallways outside conference rooms and in performance reviews where she told me the timing wasn't right. I had never heard it go silent before. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was the most honest 4 seconds I had experienced in 5 years of working with her. Richard said quietly, Jennifer, my office. I have to go to my dad, I said. He's at Holy Cross. I turned around. Someone said my name, Richard, and then Diane Price, and I think Greg from Heartwell, though I could not imagine what he was offering. I did not stop. I walked through the room, past the servers with the untouched catering, past the table of colleagues who had been watching, through the glass doors into the hallway. I took the elevator to the lobby. I stood alone in that small moving box and breathed. I had been holding my breath for so long, not just that evening, but for years, in some structural sense. The breath you hold when you are constantly waiting for a situation to change and constantly adjusting yourself to accommodate the fact that it hasn't, that the simple act of breathing with nothing to brace for felt strange, almost unfamiliar. The elevator reached the lobby. I walked out into the cold. November in DC, the air carrying the particular weight of the season's first real cold front. I got to my car. I sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes without starting it. My phone rang. Unknown number. I answered because I thought it might be the hospital. Is this Jennifer Albright? Yes. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm a founding partner at Webb & Greer, Employment Law, offices in Bethesda. I just received a call from Diane Price, who is a personal friend. She was at an event this evening. A pause. She suggested I should speak with you as soon as possible. I looked at the windshield. The streetlights outside the garage entrance were making long orange shapes on the concrete. I have documentation of sustained intellectual property misappropriation over a 5-year employment period, I said. I have time-stamped source files, email chains, and a voice recording of my former manager explicitly stating her intention to take credit for my work for the purpose of her own career advancement. I also have documentation of the illegal removal of a formally granted disability accommodation, remote work arrangement under Maryland Family and Medical Leave that was revoked while my father was actively undergoing cancer treatment. There was a pause on his end. A short one. That's quite a lot, Marcus Webb said. I'm aware. Are you driving right now? I'm about to drive to Holy Cross Hospital. How is your father? I don't know yet. Okay, can you come to my office tomorrow? 9 a.m. I'll have my associate pull the relevant Maryland statutes overnight. I drove to Holy Cross. My father was in the emergency department when I arrived, conscious and frustrated with himself in the way he always was when his body failed to cooperate with his expectations of it. The fall had been minor. He had caught himself partially, nothing broken, but the internal bleeding was a secondary complication from his most recent treatment cycle, and they needed to keep him for observation. I sat with him for 3 hours. He was asleep by 11. I drove home. The weeks that followed were not the clean, cinematic reversal that some part of me had wanted when I walked across that party room. The part of me that had spent 5 years suppressing the desire for a clear and immediate accounting, that part had wanted a reckoning that happened in real time, with witnesses, in one definitive scene. Real accountings don't work that way. They are slower and procedurally messier and more thorough than anything a single evening can accomplish. Marcus Webb filed a formal complaint with Whitmore Group's board of directors on a Wednesday, 11 days after the party. The complaint was 31 pages long. It cited 5 documented instances of attribution fraud with supporting evidence, the audio recording, the email chain, the authorship metadata, and the revocation of the remote work accommodation, which, Marcus explained during our first meeting with a precision that I found both clarifying and quietly devastating, had specific legal weight under Maryland state employment protection statutes, given my father's documented diagnosis and his status as my sole dependent family member under the relevant provisions. Richard Voss moved within 48 hours of the complaint being received. Sandra was placed on administrative leave. An outside The HR firm, not the company's in-house team, an independent firm, was retained to conduct the review. I know this because Diane Price called me on the Thursday of that week without prompting to tell me that the review was happening and that she had provided a personal statement. I want to be honest with you, Diane said. She had a directness I respected even then. I noticed things over the years. I told myself there were explanations. That was insufficient of me, and I'm sorry for it. I said I appreciated her telling me. She was very good at managing perception, Diane said. That's not an excuse. I know. Patrick Dunn called me 10 days after I quit. He asked if we could talk. I said yes, out of curiosity mostly, and because I had nothing to protect against by that point. He told me that when Sandra had briefed him on the Heartwell engagement prior to the announcement, she had described it as a project she had led start to finish, a solo vision she had built from the ground up. He told me he had started to question that framing once he had actually looked at the files. Your name is in the metadata on everything, he said. I know how to look at file properties. He had provided a voluntary statement to the outside HR firm. I do not know whether Patrick Dunn acted out of conscience or out of the calculation that the investigation was going to reach him anyway. I do not particularly need to know. His information was accurate, and it corroborated what I had already submitted, and that is the only part that mattered. There were other people who came forward during the review process. That surprised me. A woman named Fatima, who had been on the strategy team for 2 years before I arrived, who had left Whitmore in 2021 and attributed her departure to the culture without ever elaborating. She reached out to Marcus's office after reading about the investigation in a trade publication that covered the filing. She had her own documents, her own stories, her own version of the same morning, the lit-up conference room, the slides on the wall, the name not on anything. I called her once, briefly, near the end of the process. We spoke for about 20 minutes. By the end of the call, she was crying, and so was I, which neither of us had expected, and we said goodbye and have not spoken since. I think about her sometimes, about how long she had been carrying her version of it. There was also a junior analyst named Marcus, different Marcus, no relation to my lawyer, who had documented an incident from 2022 in which Sandra had presented a client audit he had developed as her own work in a pitch that won a contract renewal. He had never said anything because he had been 24 years old and afraid, and did not know there was something to be said. His documentation was clean and detailed, and it widened the scope of the investigation considerably. The settlement was finalized in February of 2024. The terms are confidential, and I will keep them that way. What I will say is that 5 years of documented intellectual property theft, the audio recording, and the illegal revocation of a medical accommodation carry considerably more legal and financial weight than I had understood before I had a lawyer explain it to me. Marcus Webb is extraordinarily good at his job. Sandra Alcott left Whitmore Group. The new real estate communications practice was folded back into the general strategy team before it launched. Richard Voss sent me a personal email in March of 2024. It was brief and formal, as I expected it would be from him. It contained one line I have not forgotten. The organization fell short of what you deserved. I am sorry for that. It was not enough. It was also something. I have made a deliberate peace with the distance between those two assessments. My father completed his final round of chemotherapy in January of 2024. His most recent scan, April 2024, 3 months after treatment ended, showed no evidence of disease. He is back in the garden. The tomatoes are coming in. He called me last Sunday to tell me the Nats lost in the 9th inning and he watched the whole thing anyway, because he is, he said, a person of optimism. I have a different job now. I joined Kellard Partners in March of 2024 as a senior strategist. It is a smaller firm, 42 people, 3 offices, no executive floor with a view of the waterfront. My manager is a man named David Reyes, who has been doing this work for 23 years and who attributes work to the people who did it as a matter of such basic professional practice that the first time he forwarded my analysis to a client with my name in the header, I felt something I had to sit with for a moment before I could identify it. It was relief, just relief. The specific relief of a person who has been braced for a thing to be taken away and suddenly understands that in this room, in this context, it will not be. I still show up early, not because I am afraid of what happens if I don't, but because I like the quality of a building before it fills. I like the way a desk looks before a day has made demands of it, clean and containing only what you put there, not yet full of other people's urgencies. I spent 5 years arriving at 6:50 a.m. to be useful to someone else before they arrived. Now I arrive at 7 and those first 30 minutes are entirely mine. I read, I make notes. I think about what I actually want to accomplish that day, not what someone else needs me to have accomplished by 9. It is a small thing. It matters more than I can fully explain. I like the quiet of a desk before the day has made demands of it. I like having 30 minutes that belong entirely to me before I give my best thinking to someone else. I have thought about Sandra Alcott a great deal since leaving Whitmore, and I want to be honest about what I think. She was not cartoonishly villainous. She was not a person who woke up every morning and decided to harm me. She was a person with a specific and coherent set of beliefs about how organizations work, that visibility was a resource to be managed, that credit was competitive rather than documentable, that the people who did the work were interchangeable with the people who stood in front of it as long as the right person was standing in front. She believed, I think, genuinely, that she had earned the position she held, that the management of people who produced results was itself the work, and that her ability to recognize and direct talent was a skill that justified the way she used it. What she failed to account for was was that I had been watching, that I had been keeping records, even before I understood why, that the person she had spent 5 years looking through had spent 5 years becoming very good at documenting exactly what she was doing. Her own overreach unmasked her. I did not need to construct the case against her. I simply needed to stop being the person who protected her from it. I showed up first for 5 years. I stayed last. I handed over every idea I had, and I told myself that was how you built something, by doing the work faithfully and trusting that the record would eventually speak for itself. The record did speak for itself, just not in the way I had imagined. Not slowly, through the accumulation of institutional recognition. It spoke on a Friday evening in November, in a room full of witnesses, when I put the documents in front of the people who had the authority to act on them, and I said clearly and without apology, this is what actually happened here. I grieved the years. That is the honest thing to say. Not dramatically. I did not have a period of visible crisis or collapse, but I grieved them quietly, in the months after I left, in the way that you grieve something you knew was already gone before you admitted it. I grieved the version of my early career that I had believed in, the one where hard work and patience and good faith effort were currencies that institutions honored. I grieved the time I did not spend with my father because I was at my desk at midnight. I grieved the version of myself who had said, I'll handle it, so many times that I had stopped noticing the cost of handling everything. And I grieved Sandra in a way I did not expect to. Not Sandra, the person who stole my work. Sandra, the person I had spent 5 years trying to earn something from. Approval, acknowledgement, the basic professional dignity of having my name on my work. That version of Sandra, the one I had been trying to reach through the quality and quantity of my output, had never existed. She was a story I had been telling myself in the absence of the real one. Grieving her was grieving the end of a useful fiction, and that grief was real, even if it was also a form of relief. Here is what I know now that I did not know then. The behind-the-scenes person is not a different kind of person from the one who stands at the front of the room. The behind-the-scenes person is the operation, the thinking, the research, the late nights, the structural intelligence of a well-built pitch. That is not support work. That is the work. The person who presents it is delivering a performance. The person who built it is doing the work. These are not equivalent contributions, and any organization that treats them as such, that treats the deliverer as the author and the author as infrastructure, will eventually produce a moment like the one in that conference room. A moment where the person who built the whole thing is standing at the wall holding a coffee tray. I am not going to tell you that I am glad it happened. I am not one of those people who reframes every painful thing as secretly generative. 5 years is a real amount of time. The money I spent on car services when I could have been driving my father myself is real money. The nights I was not at the hospital are real nights. Those things do not become fine just because the ending was better than the middle, but I am the person I am now partly because of those 5 years. I know what I built. I know exactly what I am capable of building. I know how to document it and what it's worth and what I will and will not accept in exchange for it. I know that institutions need to be watched and that records need to be kept, and that the moment you understand you have been inside a system that was never going to give you what you earned is the moment you stop waiting for it to change its mind. I showed up first and stayed last and handed over every idea I had. And when she looked across that room at me like I was a function and said my name like a task assignment, I finally understood. I was never the invisible one. She was the one who couldn't survive without me. And the day I stopped making that her secret was the day I got my name back.